Hello, hi Anne.
Hi.
So, first of all, we want to thank everybody that stayed for the second part of the conversation about New Weird. And first of all, we want to thank Anne for accepting our invitation to join in this conversation today, being here with us today. And for those who don't know her, I will make a brief introduction, okay? Anne VanderMeer is an award-winning editor and anthologist. She currently serves as an acquiring editor for Tor.com and Weird Fiction Review, and she is the editor-in-residence for Shared Worlds, a science fiction and fantasy writing camp for high school students. Her latest anthologies include The Time Traveler's Almanac, Sisters of the Revolution, The Big Book of Science Fiction, The Big Book of Classic Fantasy, and The Big Book of Modern Fantasy. And would you like to add some information?
Well, I'm also the editor of The Weird, which I think is one of the reasons why y'all invited me. And then I'm also the editor of The New Weird. And these are the subjects we're going to be talking about today. And I just want to start off by saying I love weird fiction. I love reading it. I love talking to writers that write it. And I'm very honored and happy to be here.
Okay, thank you very much. And now, George and Vicky, could you introduce yourselves, please?
Well, hello. My name is George Amaral. I'm a writer, psychoanalyst, and PhD student in literary theory at Universidade de São Paulo, here in Brazil. Well, my research is related to how strangeness in fiction can provide a critical view of reality. Right now, in this moment, I am studying how the concept of Anthropocene and the ecological crisis demands new ways of thinking about the world and how it influences and is influenced by fiction. So I'm very interested in this discussion today. Vic?
Hi everyone, my name is Vic Vieira. I'm a sci-fi and weird fiction writer. I'm also a translator and a visual artist. And I'm a queer, non-binary, transmasculine person, and my pronouns are they, them. In my work, I explore a lot of questions about gender and sexuality and bodies through the lens of weird fiction. So I'm really excited to be here today, and thank you so much, Ian.
Thank you, Vic. Thank you, George. Now, I have to say that if you have any question, you can write it on the Zoom chat. You can write in Portuguese or in English or in Spanish, okay? And I'll ask that you keep your microphones muted, okay? So that we can talk. And let's start, right? George, would you like to ask the first question?
Sure. Well, and we are facing weird times as we were talking just right now. So public health crisis, political crisis, ecology crisis, climate change and global warming have arrived with wildfires, hurricanes, mass extinctions. At the same time, in Brazil and other parts of the world, the polluted, unequal and grotesque cities of the New Weird continue to be very familiar to us. In this sense, do you consider that the strangeness devices of weird fiction still have the potential to awaken our critical awareness of reality? Are there new ways to do this today? Are we already under the context of a next weird?
The thing about weird fiction is it is a way for us to make sense of the world that we're living in right now. So in that context, weird fiction will always be with us, but it's going to change depending on the environment around the writers that are writing it. And of course, later on, when readers read the work of weird writers, they're going to be reading it in the context and from a perspective of where they're coming from their worldview. So I consider weird fiction to be a way to always have this conversation and a way for us to interrogate the unknown. Because here's the thing, yes, we are living in strange and unusual times, but I'm sure that if you asked people 100 years ago, they would probably be saying the same things as well. But we don't know what the future is going to bring. We don't know what's around the corner. We don't know what tomorrow's going to be. But that's what we do with weird fiction, is we take a look at all those things, the things that we don't understand, the things that are unknown to us, and we explore what those possibilities could be. And the thing about weird fiction that is so extraordinary to me is the visionary aspects of it. A lot of times, like you're talking about some of the things that you have read, and now we look at the world today, and there's some parallels there. There's almost like it's prophetic in a way, that we were able to see, those writers back then were able to see what the world was going to be. They may or may not, but they are expanding their imagination through weird fiction, through asking the questions, things that we don't know. How do we explore the unknown? And the thing about weird fiction is it doesn't always answer the question, and it doesn't have to. It's just that beauty of the exploration of what it might be. And that's why I feel like weird fiction is always going to be with us, and it's always going to change and permeate based on the world that we're living in, and each individual writer and reader, what they bring to it from their own personal experiences.
Okay, thank you. And
so next question is, it has a lot to do with your answer too, because in the anthology The Weird, a compendium of strange and dark stories from 2011, you trace the history of weird fiction from the beginning of the 20th century until 2010. And the new weird is a moment that already happened, even though we still talk about it as new writers are writing new weird today. But how does the new weird today dialogue with these other manifestations of the weird, and especially the most recent ones? And I'm thinking about not only stories of our most recent ecological crisis, but stories also from authors belonging to marginalized groups, exploring issues of gender, sexuality, and trauma through, for example, body horror, or what I like to call a kind of body euphoria that I think works so well in weird fiction.
Well, again, as I was saying before, weird fiction allows us to explore and ask questions and interrogate what's happening to us right now. And the difference between weird and new weird is that new weird was basically a movement that took place in the early 2000s, having to do with secondary world fiction that had this weird kind of supernatural element to it. So with weird fiction, when you take a look at it historically, it was basically in the world as it was existing then, but then something strange permeates it. Whereas with new weird, the entire world was different and yet accepted, and people just went about their daily lives in that secondary weird world that they were living in. So it was a little bit of a different thing. Now, as far as the ecological crisis and the things that we're looking at now, and also exploring issues of gender and sexuality, we have always had that through our fiction. But what's happening now, and what I celebrate so much, is that we are giving more open voices to that. And I feel like the fact that we have things like the internet, in some ways it makes our world so much larger, because we have the ability to connect with people all over the world and explore their different perspectives. And I think that's very important, because weird fiction continues to be relevant and important, because it does allow us to view the world through other perspectives. And that's very important, because otherwise your world becomes too small and you have blinders on and you're not seeing the wider thing. So when you have other voices and people asking questions, again, we're going back to, it's an exploration and an interrogation of the unknown. And we may never know it, but we do want to explore it. It's that thing of the curiosity, right? Human beings just are curious, and we're always asking questions. We may never come to the answers, but oh, wow, what an adventure trying to explore it, right? And I think that the more voices and the more diversity that we have in those voices from all over the world are very important to continue this conversation on into the future. And I kind of think about how wonderful it would be if I could transport myself 100 years from now and see what those conversations are. You know, what are the conversations of my great-grandchildren going to have about this type of fiction? Because I can kind of get an idea of what it was like 100 years ago, but I have no idea what it's going to be in the future. And I love the idea that that world is just expanding and getting larger.
If I can just ask a follow-up question really quick. When you talk about the new weird as the secondary word that is fully weird, can we think about different communities that have a different reality, and it's like they themselves have a secondary world of themselves, and they live as fully what to the outside will look like a fully weird life, a fully new weird life, let's call it like that, but for them it's just the day-to-day life.
Yes, absolutely. I think that that's really true. And I do see a lot of that coming out in fiction that I'm reading today. I'm seeing how people have accepted it's almost like a surrender to the weird. Let's talk about it in those senses, because it's what your life is and you're just surrendering to it and just letting it be what it is and letting it flow and letting it happen. And maybe in those senses, you're not interrogating as much as you are exploring to try to make sense of it, but not in a way that you're afraid. See, that's the thing. A lot of people think that weird fiction is horror fiction, but you know, there are concentric circles, but weird doesn't necessarily mean horrifying. It doesn't necessarily mean scary. It's just really unknown. And sometimes the unknown can be scary, but it doesn't have to be. And that's one of the other things that I love about weird fiction, is that there can be beauty in the grotesque. And what we see as grotesque, it's only grotesque because it's not familiar to us, you know? But if you explore it even further, I have a very good friend who is an amazing poet, and he recently had a book launch of his new poetry collection, and he read a poem about convulsions. You know, he often has, you know, fits and convulsions with his illness, and his poem that he wrote about it was about the beauty of it, the beauty in that pain and the beauty in going through that. And when he was reading that poem on his online book launch, I was really moved to tears, because it's something that I never thought about in terms of that's his world. He's used to that world and he is finding beauty in that world. And for me, as an outsider not experiencing what he experiences, I was able to connect through his poetry, through his language. And I found that to be really beautiful. And I think that that speaks to what you're talking about, where people are living in these different worlds and they have a different perspective and they don't see it as weird, but somebody outside might. So to me, what Dominique did with that poem was so perfect in encapsulating what you're talking about. The name of his poetry collection is Side Effects May Include Strangers. And his name is Dominique Parisien. He is a French-Canadian writer and editor.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much.
Well, in this sense, before I ask the other question that changes the subject, how do you think this kind of visionary view of the weird differs from classic science fiction and classic fantasy? You talked about a sense of wonder different from a sense of fairy, right? the anthology,
Mhm.
and that's in this sense of uncanny. So how do you see this difference between what we can perceive with the weird, this what you're just talking about, and the other side, the classical fantasy, the classical science fiction?
Well, when you're talking about science fiction, you're talking about fiction about the future, and it may or may not have fantastical elements in it. I mean, the typical science fiction story is going to have more of technology, gadgets, spaceships, things like that, thinking towards the future as far as how human beings are going to interact and communicate with the technology of the future. And I see science fiction more in that vein, although when we did the Big Book of Science Fiction, we wanted to broaden that and also bring in what some people might consider more science fantasy, like the Jack Vance stories, for example. But in the same sense, when you take a look at fantasy, there is something more fantastical in it, and it doesn't necessarily explore what's unknown as much as it is dealing with the supernatural in a different way. So, for example, when you talk about fantasy stories, you could be talking about fairy tales, and in many cases, especially in the terms of classic fairy tales, a lot of those stories were told in a way to be able to be morality tales, in a sense, and they were told in order to maintain the status quo. Although not all classic fantasy stories did have that purpose, but many of them did. You know, the stories that you would tell to children to scare them or to make them behave in a certain way. And what you see today and what's coming out in fantasy writing today is actually doing the opposite. Instead of maintaining the status quo, it's trying to break up the status quo and really envision what the world could be if things were different. So when you take a look at fantasists writing today, they have this whole world that they can paint, and it can be the world that we live in with fantastical elements, or it could be a secondary world. And I see when people think about fantasy fiction, they're thinking about The Hobbit, and they're thinking about that type of thing, secondary world fantasy. But fantasy, as you were saying, can also be how people look at magic realism and the work that comes out of Latin America. We're thinking of Borges. We're thinking of I'm sorry, the names are blanking on me now. Even writers like Leonora Carrington or crap, who wrote Blowout? Cortázar is who I'm thinking. Isabel Allende is another writer, as just somebody said that. But in that sense, the fantasy kind of intersects and infects the real world and comes in, and the characters in those stories are reacting or interacting with the fantastical elements that are around them, and they might not necessarily see them as being unusual or strange. It's just a matter of fact. You know, this is what happens. A butterfly comes down and starts talking to you, and that's just the way the world is. And I find that to be very inspirational and beautiful. And so I don't know if I'm really answering your question. I hope I am.
I think yes. So back to the script. Latin America has a specific tradition. So we were just talking about that. A specific tradition of fantastic and speculative fiction, very different from the Anglophone one. Our cultural framework is formed by elements from different traditions, many of them with fantastic or even weird traits, like indigenous tales, folklore, religious narratives, stories from African tradition, among others. In literature, for example, we have magical realism. Therefore, we can, when we create weird or new weird fictions, we end up distorting the original conventions of these genres. That was Teresa was talking about some moments ago. So, as an editor, how do you view these internal and external influences and distortions of genre conventions in local fictions? And thinking about the US reception of our narratives, would it be more productive if we create a new term to describe it?
Well, you have to keep in mind that I don't have an academic background, so I don't think in terms of literary movements as much as, although I've done books of literary movements, but I think in terms of what makes the story great. And I do love the whole idea of mixing and matching and taking all of these traditions and turning them on their heads, because that's, I think, necessary in order to make the story new and fresh. Because when you think about it, as an editor, I've read a bazillion stories in my lifetime, a bazillion. And I've seen almost every kind of story you can tell. So in order for me to approach a story and find it new and fresh, all those things you're talking about changing the traditions and turning them around and mixing and matching, to me, that's exactly what a writer will do. And they're bringing their own perspectives in it, whether they realize it or not. Even though the characters in the book and the stories might not be that particular writer, they're still bringing their own perspective into it and their own worldview. And their own worldview isn't necessarily just going to be what's in their backyard. It can also be the experiences they have had through what they have read, what they have challenged, what they have seen, and all of those things come into their fiction and inform it. It's kind of like, we talk about here in America being a melting pot of ideas. There is this one thing that I see in a lot of American fiction is this whole hope and optimism that I might not see in a lot of other fiction from other countries, but I just sometimes feel like I'm seeing a lot of this, I don't know, superiority in a sense that's coming from writers that write in America as opposed to maybe some other countries. When I was reading for some of these other anthologies, and I was reading stories from Eastern Europe, and then stories from Latin America, and then stories from the Middle East, and then stories from America, I definitely saw a difference in a point of view and how the same concepts were being approached. There was kind of like a different spin on American writers, although what I'm seeing now is because so many people in America are writing from different traditions and different backgrounds and different histories, that's changing as well, which I think is fantastic. And I do love the idea of different traditions coming together and mixing up. I do love seeing writers that are inspired and influenced by writers that went before, but then they take it farther and they make it theirs. And I'm very much appreciative of doing that, because what I don't want to see is I don't want to see a new writer write a Stephen King story. I want that new writer to write their own story. Stephen King writes his own stories and he does them just fine. So yes, when writers first start out, they're trying to find their voice. So they might write stories that emulate some of their favorites. And that's great, because it's all an exercise and it's all a benefit to what they're going to be able to write. But eventually what will happen is they will come to find their own voice as they continue, and then their writing is going to change and grow as they change and grow as a person and as they have more experiences in life. And it's not going to be just their lived experience, but also what they come into contact with when they're reading. I remember a million years ago when I was very young, somebody once told me that you're going to be the same person you are today in the future, that only two things will change you: the books that you read and the people that you meet. So those are the two experiences that every person is going to have in their life that's going to change them, whether for good or for bad or for whatever. But I thought that was very interesting, and I think about that a lot, because what they were trying to say when they told me that is that you need to ask yourself, what am I reading? Who are the people that I'm spending time with? How is that changing me? And is that where I want to go? So I think about that a lot when I'm reading fiction. What am I reading and where is it bringing me? And how is it changing my experience, and how is it making me a better person? How is it, I know Pollyanna, making the world a better place, but I do believe in my naivety maybe that stories and storytellers can change the world for the better, can inform the world. Because here's the other thing about visionary fiction is that a lot of people are inspired by the fiction that they read that are not necessarily other writers, but other people in the world doing other things. They could be doctors, they could be teachers, they could be engineers, they could be astronauts, and so they're reading the stories too, and they're being inspired and informed by it. And so think about that as well. So those influences that are coming through the writers, and they're exploring these ideas in all these different ways, are going to be spread out throughout the world. And again, I can't say this enough, but when the reader reads it, the reader brings their own impressions to it. So the story on the page, whatever the writer wrote, they had an intention, but the reader comes and brings their own prejudices, their own lived experience to it. The story changes. And then here's the other thing. That same reader is going to read that story maybe 10 years from now. They're a different person. Now when they read that story, the story is different again. And that's, to me, the beauty of fiction, is the words on the page constantly change based on where you're coming from.
That was so beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm a reader first, so I'm a lover of stories.
We all are.
Yes, of course we are. That's why we're here.
I'm going to jump to another question because it has a lot to do with what you answered right now. So as a writer, I always go back to Donna Haraway's thinking about making king in the Cthulhu scene. It inspires me a lot, thinking about messy and complex ecologies, this kind of cat's cradle of interspecies relationships, as part of our kin, our family in a way, and not just a pile of resources waiting to be exploited. How do you think this kind of revolutionary ecological thinking being explored and experimented in fiction, and especially with fiction nowadays, how could that play a part in our reorientation as a species? This is kind of a big philosophical question, but how can this have how can this change our development of new ways of living in this planet?
I think that's an excellent question and a great approach to thinking about weird fiction. One of the things that I was so excited about in some of my reading is when I was reading stories from the point of view of plants or animals. And sometimes, most of the time when I read stories from those point of views, they fail miserably because they don't really understand a different species in that sense. But occasionally you'll come across a story that's just so perfect. And I do think that it's important for us to think very closely about those relationships. And as I see more and more people learning about the environment around us and how we relate to nature and what those conversations are, we do embrace it more. I mean, there are still going to be people out there that see the world around us as something to take advantage of and something to use. But as we are seeing our resources change and dwindle, and as we see climate change coming upon us, we do need to think very hard about what our relationships are with nature. And we are learning so much more about the animal world and the plant world. And they do have a completely, to us, alien perception of the world. But if we can just for a moment think about how they see the world, I think that's going to change our relationship to them and how we care for the world, because we see ourselves as being at the top of the food chain. I don't know if we necessarily are, but that's the way we see ourselves, like we can just do whatever we want. But we are coming to realize now that we are also the caretakers and we are also responsible for what's around us. So we need to take care of it or we're going to lose it. And I do see a lot of really wonderful writings coming out of this now, because here's the thing. Scientists cannot tell stories very well unless they're writers. You know, when a scientist is trying to explain to you climate change or, you know, species extinction or something like that, that the average human being's eyes are going to glaze over because it's boring scientific terms. But the storytellers can take what the scientists are experiencing and they can put it into terms that the layman can understand. And the storytellers can tell those stories in ways that allow the reader to connect and understand without it being a scientific school lecture. And so I think that's very important now. And there has been a lot of, I guess you call it climate change fiction being written that misses the mark because it doesn't really take in the whole world and it's not as realistic as it could be. But you're seeing more and more people grappling with that now. When you take a look at even just a mainstream novel, they're dealing with it. I remember a couple of years ago, I was reading it's a detective novel from a writer in Iceland. Okay, just a detective novel, not, you know, science fiction or anything like that. But even the characters in that book, and this was 5 years ago, we're talking about climate change because it's part of the world. You know, so if you're writing something even in the mainstream market, you can't not mention that because it's not realistic and it doesn't make sense otherwise. You know, I live in Florida. How many hurricanes have we had? We're on what? Eta right now. I think we've gone through the entire alphabet and now we're doing the you know, I don't know what we're doing now, but we still have hurricanes. And if you're living in the world today, you have to be able to recognize that those things are happening around you. Again, as I said before, weird fiction is an interrogation of the unknown, but it's allowing you to make sense of the world as it is today. So I think more and more people are taking a closer look at the world around them. You know why? Because they can't not. They have to.
Weird fiction is coming to them.
That's right. Whether they want it to or not, it's coming.
Yes. That's awesome. Thank you.
So before we open to the public questions, I will ask another one. And well, regarding those elements of weird that we are talking, do you see other media, movies, television series, comics? Do you see this happening? This kind of elements appearing in other media? Or I think the question is, do you have suggestions that you like?
Well, I mean, it's definitely permeating the world. It's always been there, but it's now popular. It's now popular. I mean, I'll just give you one example, Lovecraft Country. If anyone has seen that series, I mean, that's a perfect example of weird fiction on the screen. And another example would be the Watchmen series. Even though that's more science fictional, it's still dealing with a lot of weird elements with the supernatural and all. And right now, my husband and I are binge watching a wonderful series called Doom Patrol. Have y'all ever heard of Doom Patrol? It's a fantastic series, and it's semi about superheroes, but not really. And we are watching that and absolutely loving it. And that I'm finding very, very wonderful. And I saw a question come by about whether or not I read graphic novels, and I actually do, not as much as I used to, but believe it or not, I have been trying to learn French for about 5 years now. And one of the main reasons why I've been trying to learn French is because they have such great graphic novels, and I love them so much. And I got started on them by reading the Dungeon series, and I loved those books so much. But of course, they were translated into English. And when I found out that the original writers of those graphic novels were French, and they were originally written in French, it allowed me to explore some of the other comics that were out there, but so many of them are written in French and not going to be translated. So if I want to read them, I have to learn French. So yes, I have been studying French for about 5 years, still can't speak it, but I'm almost to the point where I can read a graphic novel now, so yay.
Yeah, that's great. Julie, can we jump your question so that we can ask the question from Uva? It's related to comics, right? Uva, would you like to open your microphone and ask your question yourself? If you want to, you can do it now. Okay. Yeah?
Oh, hi. My camera is not working today, but...
No problem.
I would like to ask, do you read any comics, like comic books? And
Yes,
have you ever found some new weird science fiction in US graphic novels? Or, I don't know, any artists that are particularly inclined to get in the medium like that, or are close? I don't know, because however well-informed we are here over the internet, I feel like being there in the US, you might have come in contact with more artists than we can see here. So that's the question. Thank you.
Well, I mean, I used to read a lot more graphic novels than I do now. The time has just gotten away from me where I can't do it. But there was a time when I was writing an art column for IO9, the IO9 website. Every month I profiled a different artist. And one of the things that I did is I explored a lot of artists that were doing things in graphic novels, and a lot of the ones that I found were doing their work in other countries. There was one artist from Serbia named Ivica Stevanovic, and we actually published some of his work in our books. And he's done some graphic novels that are absolutely mind-blowing, and I love his artwork. So that's somebody to look for. Ivica Stevanovic, that's close. It's I-V-I-C-A, yeah. Ivica Stevanovic, and he's in some of the books that we have. He's in the Cabinet of Curiosities, I believe, and also in Wonder Book. And I would like to be able to get back to that and see more of that. I love that whole idea of taking a look at weird fiction through the lens of graphic novels, because there's so much more that you can do in a graphic novel that you can't really do in a novel by marrying the art and the language together. It's a completely different art form. And I need, now that you're mentioning all that, I need to get back into reading more graphic novels. It's been a while since I've done that. Still working on my French.
Okay, thank you. And Julie, I'm sorry that I had to jump your question, but it was because the question from Uva was related to the topic Anne was talking about. So now, Julie, would you like to ask your question? Would you like to open your microphone and ask your question?
Yes, sorry, I am not Julie, but I am using my sister's computer, so that's why
happens to me every time.
That's why it's Julie. Yeah, I am Arthur. So first of all, thanks, Anne, for being here talking to us. And my question has to do with something you said before, in the very beginning of the conversation, which is the new weird is largely defined by the secondary word feature, right, of this generation in the early 2000s. Mm-hmm. I thought of some far future science fiction, especially in the 70s and 80s, that have a lot to do with weird fiction and defamiliarization. I thought of Strangers by Gardner Dozois, A Song for Leah by George R. R. Martin, and Bloodchild by Octavia Butler, but I'm certain there are more. So being in the far future, could you call it secondary word? And if so, could you see them as predecessors of this 2000s generation?
Oh, absolutely. You could see it as a predecessor. But the thing about what you're talking about is more, a lot of science fiction could really be seen as science fantasy because it's so far in the future and because it has those fantastical elements that it's not just straight ahead science fiction. And the thing that's interesting about that is that when you take a look at the new weird, in a way, it kind of grew out of the new wave. You're talking about the 70s. The new wave movement, which came out of England in the 60s and the 70s, was a way of approaching science fiction in a more experimental kind of a way. And the new weird also kind of came out of the UK as well. But what it was doing, what the new wave did to science fiction, I feel like the new weird did with horror. You see what I'm saying? So it was actually dealing with more experimental ways to explore weird fiction. And the other thing is that the new wave and the new weird, what they both had in common is taking a look at the actual literature itself and not just looking at it as being genre fiction, but it's literature. And so the new wave and the new weird did have those two things in common. And a lot of great writing came out of that. But here's the other thing, in both places, is the writers that were writing in that mode, that were being put out there as new weird writers, have done so many other things. So it's not just this one thing. And it's like, in a sense, it's like a jumping off point, but it was, to me, more of a moment in time than something that is continuing. It's like morphed. It's morphed and changed. I'm hoping that answered your question.
Yes, it did. So thank you.
Thank you. Vicky, you have a question, right?
Yes. Going back a little bit to the issue of writing from different perspectives, from different species points of view, do you think that new weird and weird fiction in general, that these writers, they have a kind of a different, kind of a unique way of using language, not only in stylistic choices or using experimental formats, but in the way of describing the environments and the cities and the creatures? Do you think that the weird has a different sensibility to things?
Well, every writer is going to approach it differently. And some writers that might be writing in that vein might not consider themselves to be weird writers. We're just seeing it that way because what they're writing about and how they're writing is unusual to us or to the reader. So they might consider it that way. So some of the things that you're talking about, you're seeing that kind of writing also permeating in the literary mainstream world. It's not just in weird fiction, although they are, as far as I'm concerned, most definitely writing weird fiction, but the writer doesn't see themselves that way. You know, they're just writing from the perspective of this or that, or they're looking at the world in a different way. But it's definitely, again, as I said, it's coming to get you. Whether you like it or not, it's there, and it's there for us to explore, and it's there for us to play with. And that may very well be the next big jumping off point of where people are going to be focusing their attention when they're looking at storytelling. Because as much as we know the world that we live in, we don't know a lot. We know very, very little. We don't even know about our own bodies. We think we do, but we don't. That's why they call medicine an art and not a science, because we don't know. We really, truly don't. And so we can internalize all these things in our bodies, but then when we take a look at the world around us, there's no way that you can really know how, it's hard enough to know how another person feels, but to think about how another species feels. You know, how does that raccoon in my backyard really think about the grapes that I left out there for him? You know, is he happy about that? Should I put it over here? You know, I don't know. What are they thinking about when they're playing with that tennis ball that was left in the backyard?
Yeah, when I think about this, I always go back to the book H is for Hawk.
Oh, yes.
I forgot the name of the author. I'm so sorry.
Helen McDonald.
That's it.
Helen
That
McDonald.
book
That's
is phenomenal. And
it is.
I mean, it's kind of weird to me. It's kind of weird literature, but it's not weird fiction, but it's to me, it is weird literature in a way.
Right, because she really connected to the birds that she was training and working with. But here's the thing, that whole book is about how she dealt with the death of her father. That's really what that book is about. But see, that's the beauty of fiction, of what you can do with fiction, is that she was trying to deal with her grief and doing it through her connection to this other creature. So yeah, she's a phenomenal writer.
Okay, So as you're talking about this, during the FutureCon, in one of the panels you attended to, you said that as an editor, reading fiction that is not directly related to fantastic literature is very important for your work. Could you give some examples of mainstream literature in which you identified traces of the new weird, and which traces are these? Does it usually happen?
Well, I mean, I do read a lot of nonfiction as well. I really like to, okay, this is going to make you laugh, but I like to read autobiographies of musicians. Like, for example, I read Elton John's autobiography, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. And it was something that I just had to read at that time. And then I read Debbie Harry's autobiography, and that was quite mind-blowing. And I don't know if I would consider their autobiographies to be weird, but you could kind of see, because I'm seeing the world through their perspective. So it's kind of strange. I also have read a lot of civil rights historical books, things like that. And I read a lot of detective fiction. But when I read detective fiction, I like to read detective fiction from other countries and not necessarily American detectives. Like right now, I am reading a detective novel by a writer named Jacob Ross, and he's a Caribbean writer. So of course, his detective is in the islands, and it's completely different. I had mentioned earlier that I was reading a series of detective novels that take place in Iceland, and I've also read ones in Sweden. I know all the, you know, Nordic noir and all that, but I do like that, and I do like to read it. But you know, I still read a lot of other things as well, and I read magazines. I read The Atlantic. There's a science writer in The Atlantic called Ed Young. It's Y-O-N-G, Ed Young. He's a science writer, and he wrote an amazing book a few years back called I Contain Multitudes. Okay, and it's about all the microscopic little, you know, probiotic thingies that are on your body. Okay, and if you read that book, it's a science book, it's a nonfiction book, but it's so beautifully written. It's called I Contain Multitudes. You cannot read that book and tell me that there's not something weird going on, because it's talking about all of these things on your body, you know? So you read that and you're like, ooh. You know? But to me, that's a perfect example of a nonfiction book that really does explore the weird, because what is the weird? You're exploring the unknown, and that's what Ed Young. So I will read anything that Ed Young writes, and it's Y-O-N-G. He's the science writer for The Atlantic. So that's somebody.
He's phenomenal as well. I love his writing too. And I think this question about the body is because it completely annihilates our idea of a closed body. Our body is not closed. Our body is porous. It contains other bodies inside it.
Exactly. And that's kind of scary, but what are you going to do? You can't wash it off. Yes, I Contain Multitudes. That's fantastic.
Just commenting on that, yesterday I had a class, and they are talking about how our body is a tube, like reality passes on us from the mouth and gets out. So reality keeps coming through us, like we are not really closed, right? We are a tube, it's something that goes.
Right.
So that's weird, and that's pure reality.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking too about what you said about autobiographies, and maybe that's a way of seeing the world from the eyes of another person. So that is why this is weird. We are touching somebody else's reality when we read an
I also
autobiography.
like to read autobiographies of chefs. There's this one that I read a couple months ago called Burn the Place Down. It's about this this woman who became a, you know, very well-known chef here in America, and her transformation and how that came to be, because she had bad drug addictions, and how she overcame her drug addictions to become this very famous chef. And so I've been reading a lot of biographies or autobiographies written by chefs as well. So it's not just famous musicians. Although I'm going to tell you right now, I am going to read Dolly Parton's new book called Song Tellers. I think it's called Song Tellers, where she talks about how she wrote her songs. Don't laugh at me. Don't laugh at me and make fun of me. I am going to read Dolly Parton's book. It'll be a great distraction, but yeah.
So now, thinking from an editor point of view and anthologist point of view, how do Brazilian fiction reach you in the US? Do you get to know of us? Which are the best ways to get known there?
God, the best way is for Fabio Fernandez to tell me what's going on. No, the way for me to know is for people to tell me about it. I mean, I don't spend a lot of time on the internet searching for things unless I'm actually working on a specific project. But the thing that has been helpful to me is the relationships that I've developed over the years, where I will have people bring things to my attention that I'm looking for. And talking about international fiction, I want to mention a book, and it's a little bit of a commercial, but I'm sorry, I'm going to do it anyway. This is a great book that just came out. It's called The Valancourt Book of World Horror Stories, and it's volume 1. So these are horror stories newly translated from all over the world, because the publishers of the people that run this publishing company do have the ability to do a lot of translations. And so I am learning about a lot of writers from around the world, some of them from South America, from reading that book, because it introduces me to that. So that's another way. When I am reading anthologies and I see a writer and I'll read the bio about that writer, I will also see in the bio that that writer was influenced by another writer, or that they published another, different writer. So I will seek that writer out. So that's usually how I find that out. Unfortunately, even though I try really hard to learn new languages, remember 5 years of French, I only can read in English. And if it's not in English, I can't. I mean, I have in the past done the Google Translate to be able to get a sense of a story. And that has been very helpful, but it's not the same as having a bona fide professional translator translate a story. God bless the translators. I love them. Where would we be without them? They don't get enough credit. They do not. Maybe that'll be my next project. Translating the translators. I don't know. But yeah, that's how I find out about writers, as people tell me. They come to or I see them in an anthology.
Okay, so now we have a question from Vanessa Guedes. Would you like to ask your question, Vanessa?
Sorry, I was mute.
Okay.
Yes, of course, it's very relevant. But before that, I want to say that it's very nice to hear someone who works as an editor reading other things than the things that you actually edit. So I think it's essential. So my question is, have you ever read Pat Smith books? Because you remind me of her. Pat Smith.
Have I ever read what kind of books?
Pat Smith, the singer. No.
Oh, Patti Smith.
Yeah.
No, I haven't read her books, but I have them. I love her work. I mean, I'm a big fan of hers, and I did get those books. At the time that her books came out, I was actually buying a lot of books, and they just, what happens with your to be read pile, it just gets farther and farther and farther and farther down. But yes, Patti Smith. And what's really interesting is that when my husband and I go to New York, there's an actual cafe in New York that she goes to every single day. And so there's a table in the back that has a reserve sign on it. No one's allowed to sit in that table. It's like kept open for, I've never seen her. Okay. I've never been that lucky, but there is a table back there that is her table. It's the name of the place is called City Bakery. And I hope they're still you know, viable. But yeah, so yeah, Patti Smith, she is a phenomenal writer. I have read pieces and parts of her books, but I haven't read them incomplete. And she's amazing because not only is she a songwriter and a musician and a writer and a poet, she's also an actress. I have seen her on different shows and things. She's actually quite remarkable as an actress too. So yeah, multi-talented, it's not fair.
Okay, so we have another question from the audience. It's another question from Uva. Uva, would you like to open your microphone to ask it?
Okay. Hi again. I've been reading some essays from Jorge Carrion. I don't even know how to pronounce his name, but he's a Spanish writer that investigates libraries and bookshops and reading habits around the world. He travels a lot, and I loved reading his book called Against Amazon. And it's not exactly against Amazon, like let's bring the bitch down, but it's kind of a investigation how the structure, how the society structures reading around some main physical points, like the libraries and the bookshops, and how that has changed in the past couple of generations. And then, well, I'm thinking here, do you have any projects about growing reading audiences, and how are libraries helping on that front? And are bookshops the main stage to reach readers? How do you get around like that?
That's an interesting question. There used to be more readers in the world because that was our form of entertainment, but now we have so many things in competition vying for our time. What I'm seeing a lot now with everyone being at home and stuck at home is I'm seeing a lot of virtual book events, and that has been really good at bringing people together. I've been able to attend a lot of book launches and book events that I otherwise wouldn't have been able to attend, even when I could travel, because you can't go everywhere. So I've been able to, and what I try to do is I try to attend book events at independent bookstores around the country, like the one that I was talking about, that book launch that was done in Toronto for Dominique Parisian's poetry book, was also from a small bookstore in Toronto called Knife Fork Books, I think is what it was called. And I do think that more and more people are starting to come back to the local bookstores in a sense. I think that this pandemic that has got us stuck at home has had us be more appreciative of what local bookstores can bring to us, but I don't know whether or not that's going to be enough. I hope that it can be. What I will say is that I think it's important to start young with the kids and to infuse in them the love and beauty of reading. Since I have been in this lockdown situation, I think it's the middle of March, I have been doing an online story time reading with my grandchildren since March, okay? One of them lives in Amsterdam and the other two live in Los Angeles. So we're going 3 time periods, and every single day I get online with them and I read books to them, whether they want me to or not. But I was looking over the list of books yesterday, and I try to vary them and give them a lot of things, but they're all boys, and there's only certain books that they're going to want me to read. But I think that it's important to instill a love of reading in the kids, because otherwise they're just going to be sitting there playing video games, you know, and you're kind of competing with that. So you need to give them that space. And that's one of the reasons why I'm involved with that Shared Worlds writing camp, because we get these teenagers coming from all over. They come together, and they're not all there because they want to necessarily be writers. They all write. They have to write when they come to the camp. But what they're really doing is they're coming together, and it's almost like it's like a mini United Nations where these kids come together and they talk about their favorite books and what they love to read. And they kind of, build their own little communities. And we've been doing it for 12 years now. There has been a couple of students that came out of that and are now published writers, but most of them don't do that. But what they do is they connect with each other, and they almost create like their own little communities, their online communities, where they continue to talk about the books that they love. And so to me, that's the best way to do that, is to start these kids young. That's why I love when independent bookstores have story time for the kids. Many libraries have story time for the kids. I think that's very important as well. A lot of libraries put on additional events. Here in Tallahassee, our local library does all kinds of events that are not just related to reading, but also community involvement and other things like that. So it's just another way of building community, whether you're doing it through books and online, or you're doing it in person, sitting in a bookstore. Seriously? Am I seeing this?
Yeah, I can share.
Do I have a president finally?
I think so.
Yay! Oh my God. Our nightmare is over. Oh my gosh. And I get to share it with all of y'all. That's fantastic.
That was the perfect ending to this.
Oh my gosh.
Yes, it's on CNN. It's so good.
Well, if CNN says it.
Yay, finally.
Oh my gosh.
We feel you, Anne.
And lots of solidarity from the South.
Thank you. Thank you.
No wars in Latin America. Yes.
Oh my gosh. Thank you for sharing that with me. I'm surprised my husband didn't come crashing through the door to tell me. He's been like checking it every 5 seconds.
But we in Brazilian too, because like Trump is the Bolsonaro support. So for us, changed everything.
Yes. Yes. Oh my gosh. That's so wonderful. Thank you. I'm so glad we could share this together.
Yes,
See?
yes.
Storytelling. It's important. It's important.
Yes, yes.
You get people together to talk about weird fiction and only good things happen.
Exactly.
True.
See? All of the enthusiasm and spirit coming from this conference that we're doing together, this discussion, it just went up into the air and made this happen. Let's all take responsibility for that, right? Credit.
Yeah.
Let's take credit.
Yeah, that's very nice. It's very good to finish our conversation in this with this good news, right? Again, I would like to thank you for joining us today on the behalf of Fantástika 451. Okay, thank you very much. It was an honor. It was a pleasure to be here with you today. Yeah, I would like to thank everybody that watched the conversation. Yeah, the conversation with Teresa, and now the conversation with Anne VanderMeer. And I will ask if you have, if you can talk about your future plans, or if you have your final remarks.
Oh gosh.
Okay.
I do have some stories coming out on Tor.com upcoming in the next couple of months, so look for them. I'm really trying to take a step back right now and assess what I want to do next. I have a lot of different things that are possibilities. I'm doing some online courses. I've been very lucky where my anthologies are being taught in different universities, and so I'm coming to speak to some of the classes and doing some workshops with some of the students, so I'm looking forward to doing that. But really right now I'm just trying to keep my family safe and engaged. I have several former students that have sent me their novels that I'm reading, so I'm doing a lot of that kind of analysis and editing of former students' works, and just I might do some. I like the idea of translating the translators. I don't know. That's an idea that came out of our conversation here. So who knows what my next project might be? But I appreciate you guys so much, and I hope and pray that someday soon I will be able to come see you and visit with you in real life. That would be my dream. I've always wanted to go to South America. That's been something that I've dreamed of since I was a teenager, and I've never been. So I would love to go. And thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you, and Kane.
Thank you, Anne.
Thank you so much. It was a huge
Keep
pleasure.
telling stories. Keep telling stories.
Yes, yes, sure. Thank you, and
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.